Hello, I'm Steve Goodacre. I'm a Professor of Emergency Medicine at the University of Sheffield, and I was the Chief Investigator for the ASES study. In this video, I'm going to describe the findings of the ASES study. I'm then going to talk to Valérie Lechene, who's a member of the Aortic Dissection Charitable Trust and is someone who has experience of suffering an acute aortic dissection. I'm going to draw on Valérie's experiences to describe how the findings of the ASES study could be put into practice. ASES stands for Aortic Syndrome Evidence Synthesis. The aim of the ASES study was to examine all the scientific literature that evaluates tests that can be used to select people with possible aortic syndrome for a CT scan. The big challenge in diagnosing acute aortic syndrome is that there are huge numbers of patients attending hospital with symptoms such as chest pain that could be due to acute aortic syndrome. We've estimated that around 1 in 1,000 patients attending hospital emergency departments with chest pain will actually have an acute aortic syndrome. Acute aortic dissection is usually diagnosed with a specialised CT scan. We can't do a specialised CT scan for everyone with chest pain, so we need to select people for the specialist CT scan, and we need to use certain tests to do this. These tests were the focus of the ASES study. We examined the scientific literature for all tests that could be used to select people for a CT scan. We identified that there were 2 tests that seem to have been widely studied. These are the Aortic Dissection Detection Risk Score and the D-dimer blood test. The Aortic Dissection Detection Risk Score uses the patient's past medical history, the characteristics of their pain, and features of their physical examination to give them a score between 0 and 3, where 0 is the lowest risk and 3 is the highest risk. So first, the patient is asked about their past medical history. Do they have Marfan syndrome, a family history of aortic syndrome, aortic valve disease, any recent surgery or manipulation of their aorta, or do they have a thoracic aortic aneurysm, all of which would put them at higher risk of developing aortic syndrome. If they have any of these, they are given 1 point on their score. They are then asked about the characteristics of their pain. Is it severe in intensity? Was it abrupt in onset? Is it ripping or tearing in quality? Again, if they have any of those features, they get another point on the aortic dissection detection risk score. And then finally, they are examined. Do they have any difference between the blood pressure in their arms? Any difference between the pulses in their arms? Do they have weakness or numbness of a limb? Do they have low blood pressure? Or do they have a heart murmur related to aortic valve disease? If they have any of these characteristics, again, they get another point onto their risk score. We identified 11 studies of the aortic dissection detection risk score. We combined the results of these studies using a statistical technique called meta-analysis. We found that 95% of people with acute aortic syndrome have a score of 1 or more. However, we also found out that 62% of people who don't have an acute aortic syndrome also had a score of 1 or more. So if we decided to do a CT scan for everyone with a score of 1 or more, we'd end up doing a lot of unnecessary CT scans. In contrast, we found that only 10% of people who don't have an acute aortic syndrome have a score of 2 or 3. That means that we could have a policy of doing a CT scan for everyone with a score of 2 or 3 without doing too many CT scans. Now, it's worth noting that guidelines in the UK from the Royal College of Emergency Medicine and the Royal College of Radiologists suggest that anyone with chest pain and features suggesting an acute aortic syndrome should have a CT scan. Now, that would be the same as suggesting that anyone with an aortic dissection detection risk score of 1 or more should have a CT scan. If we actually did that, we'd be doing a huge number of CT scans and a lot more than we are actually doing at the moment. So that suggests that the guidelines are either not being followed or they're being applied selectively. D-dimer is a blood test that's currently used to assist diagnosis of people with blood clots. It could also be used to assist with the diagnosis of acute aortic syndrome. We identified 18 studies of D-dimer, and again, we combined them using meta-analysis. We found that 96% of people with acute aortic syndrome have a positive D-dimer test. This means that if your D-dimer test is negative, you're very unlikely to have an acute aortic syndrome. However, 44% of people who do not have acute aortic syndrome had a positive D-dimer. So again, this means if we decide to do a CT scan on everyone with a positive D-dimer, we're going to do a lot of unnecessary CT scans. So could we use the D-dimer test alongside the aortic dissection detection risk score to select people for CT scanning? Well, the Canadian guidelines suggest that anyone who has one risk factor for acute aortic syndrome should have D-dimer and then have a CT scan if the D-dimer is positive. So this is similar to suggesting that anyone who has 1 point on their aortic detection risk score should have a D-dimer performed and then should have a CT scan if the D-dimer is positive. So to take us through this strategy, first, the aortic dissection detection risk score is calculated. If the score is 0, then the patient does not receive any further testing. If the score is 2 or 3, then the patient goes for a CT scan. If it's 1, they have the D-dimer blood test. If the blood test is positive, they have a CT scan. If it's negative, they have no further testing. We used mathematical modelling to compare this strategy to other possible strategies for selecting patients for a CT scan, including the UK guidance. We found that this strategy, based on the Canadian guidelines, could reduce the number of CT scans performed compared to the UK guidelines and would be the most cost-effective strategy for the NHS. Mathematical modelling can tell us what should happen if the strategies are followed, but it can't tell us what actually happens in real life. To do this, we need to do further research. So we have recommended that we need to do future research that compares a strategy based on the Canadian guideline that I've outlined to the UK strategy. This will tell us whether a combination of the aortic dissection risk score and D-dimer can be used to accurately identify acute aortic syndrome without doing too many CT scans. I'm now going to talk to Valérie Lechene, who is a member of our research team and has experience in acute aortic syndrome. And we're going to draw on her experiences to see how these findings that I've just outlined could be used in practice. Hello Valérie, thanks for agreeing to talk to us today about your experience with acute aortic syndrome. I wonder if you could just start off by telling us a bit about yourself and in particular whether you considered yourself to be healthy before this happened.
Yes, although I lead a very sedentary life since my work consists in sitting at a desk, I did regular exercise since I was involved in running with even 1 or 2 half marathons a year, and generally healthy lifestyle. So there was, and no ongoing medical conditions. So this was a big shock.
Complete shock, yeah. Any family history of any conditions, any serious conditions?
My mother had an aortic dissection at the age of 77, 3 years before I experienced the same thing.
So that's a positive family history, so that's relevant. That would have scored you a point on the aortic dissection risk score. So tell us a bit about the symptoms that you had when you suffered your aortic syndrome.
I felt a warmth and a bulge in my neck, immediately followed by a very strong pain and something that felt like a lightning bolt coming down my neck and into my chest, and radiating pain everywhere in my body.
So it was a sudden onset of a severe pain that you had.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, interesting to note that that also would have scored another point on the aortic dissection risk score. So when you got the symptoms, what did you do and what did your family do?
My husband called 999 and asked for an ambulance, and my daughter helped me to the sofa, and then we waited.
How long did you have to wait for?
We waited for 90 minutes.
Right.
I was in a lot of pain, but the pain would come and go, and I was mostly out of consciousness. I was asking for help. I was whispering and crying and asking my husband to make the ambulance happen. Yeah. He called 999 repeatedly, and he was told that and offered to take me to the emergency department, but he was told that if he did that, it would take longer for me to be assessed, so that it was in my interest to wait at home for the ambulance.
So the ambulance eventually arrived, took you to the hospital, and were you assessed straight away at the hospital?
I was assessed quite fast in the hospital. Because I had arrived with an ambulance, and I saw the ambulance report afterwards, and they had put as their diagnosis aortic dissection. Right. So I don't know how much that contributed, but I was put in a side room immediately, and an assessment happened and a conversation quite quickly.
Yeah. And do you remember what examination you had? Do you know if they checked your blood pressure in both of your arms, or if they listened to your heart for a heart murmur?
I cannot say with certainty, but the assessment seems to have been mostly a conversation right. about what I had done that day, how I was feeling, because the direction of a panic attack is what was taken immediately.
Yes. So we don't know whether you might have had some of the signs of an acute aortic syndrome, like a difference in your blood pressure or a heart murmur.
Indeed.
Right. Okay. So just putting this together, I can work out that you had at least 2 points on your aortic dissection detection risk score. And so that would suggest that you're at high risk of having acute aortic syndrome, and indeed that paramedics seem to have made that diagnosis. So we would have expected you to have a CT straight away. Did that happen?
It happened eventually, right. but not until the diagnosis of panic attack had been ruled out, which took several hours, and not until there was a change of shift and the new team sent me for a CT scan immediately.
That seems a strange way of doing things. I'd have thought they would have wanted to rule out an aortic dissection first before making a diagnosis of a panic attack rather than the other way around.
Indeed.
Yeah. How many hours later was it that you got the CT scan?
I believe it was 7 hours.
7 hours, wow. That's quite a long wait, and obviously you'd have been very worried during that time, I imagine.
I was mostly unconscious. I had been given morphine very early on because my pain was extremely severe. I suffered 3 strokes during that time, and I was in extreme pain and anguish.
Yeah. And just one other question, do you know if they did the D-dimer blood test at any point? Was that something they mentioned to you at all?
I don't know.
No, that's fine. I mean, it's just interesting thinking about the way we can apply the findings of the ASES study to your experience, that we've shown that the aortic detection risk score, if you score 2 points or more, you're at high risk of having acute aortic syndrome, and you probably ought to have a CT scan straight away. So if they'd have followed the aortic dissection risk score, you should have had that CT straight away rather than having to wait 7 hours. Whereas we don't know whether you had the D-dimer blood test, and you probably shouldn't have, because that would have just delayed the CT scan that you really needed. So very helpful for us to be able to draw on your experience there. Now you have been sharing your experience with us throughout the ASES project, and you have been a member of the project team, and it's been really, really helpful to be able to draw on your experience. I wonder if you can just reflect and tell us a bit about how you felt your experience was as part of a research team looking at acute aortic syndrome, and any thoughts you have about that?
As you know, my experience was complex and difficult to process, and being part of this research project, being part of the team, has really helped me to process and understand how there can have been this delay. So that has been very important for me. It also is very important because it has showed me the importance of dissemination of the results, and also the distance between what can be written in research papers and the practice in the emergency department. What happened to me feels like a gamble, and I know that it's a gamble that nobody wanted to take, and I feel that with this work and with the work that you and your team are going to do of working towards having the guidelines that come from the research adopted, then lives will be saved as the practice will change. And I feel that, I don't know, but I feel that having the voice of a patient in the team reminds us all of the distance between research and what happens in the day-to-day of the emergency department. So it felt very powerful, really.
Absolutely. It reminds us of why we're doing the research in the first place. And I think what you say about a gamble is very true. We're trying, with the research, we're trying to work out what the odds are and try and stack the odds more in our favour when we make these difficult decisions. So I'm glad you found it a positive experience. Would you encourage other people who have had experience as patients to get involved in research?
Definitely.
Definitely. And you found it was a positive experience yourself of helping to understand your experience?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we certainly found it very valuable to be able to draw on your experience. So thank you again for talking to us today. Thank you for being involved in the ASES study. We have further research planned, and I hope you'll carry on being involved in that and carry on finding it to be a positive experience. Thank you, Valérie.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
The ASES study has examined all the scientific literature for tests that could be used to select people with possible aortic syndrome for a CT scan. The Aortic Dissection Detection Risk Score provides a simple way of estimating a person's risk of having acute aortic syndrome and could be used by clinicians to guide their decisions around performing tests, such as a CT scan. The D-dimer test could be used in people who have a low but not a negligible risk of acute aortic syndrome to again select people who need a CT scan. However, further research is required to determine whether and how D-dimer should be used in the diagnostic workup. Thank you for watching this video.